Welcome to the Rant Ruins, where I rant about anything that my $5 a month plus patrons ask me to rant about. I stole this idea from Crunchy Bagels, who stole this idea from the artist formerly known as Digibro. Today's rant is going to be from a good friend of mine, Hermit's Nook, who asks found footage horror, the best of them and the worst of them. What is it missing, and what is it going to take to scare us next? So, found footage horror is something that I've written about in the past on multiple occasions. I've written about This House Has People on It, which is a multimedia ARG. If you don't know what an ARG is, I'm going to get into it in just a sec as long as I remember. And Creep. Creep is just a horror movie on Netflix. It is shot from the perspective of the camera of a videographer who was hired by this very shady, eccentric man. And it's an amazing movie. Creep is like one of my favorite horror movies. It's definitely recommendable. And when I wrote about it, I wrote about some of the things that made the camera work stand out as especially effective, even within its own little subgenre of the found footage horror. When there's two types, you have the mounted security camera type, and then you have the handheld device type. So one of them, it's like oftentimes shaking as they walk, and it's a little bit more chaotic. Of course, the security camera system is a lot more streamlined, more rigid. It's a lot harder to make a full movie with that. I've usually just seen it used for segments, but I'm sure it exists. Skinamarink exists, so I'm sure that exists. I don't like that movie, Skinamarink. But more importantly, the advantages of found footage horror, the main thing is just going to be that it's more immersive because it's more integrated into the real world. It considers the viewer on a meta level, which normal movies do not. In the sense that a normal movie, you're just going to be watching it, and there's a baseline suspension of disbelief there where you're like, yes, of course, I'm watching a movie. This is a work of fiction, so obviously it's not real. And people usually don't have any problem just accepting that, going over that hurdle, and enjoying the movie. But it can sometimes be even more enjoyable if that hurdle isn't there. Because if the brain is seeing something that it associates with real footage, then it's going to take a lot less suspension of disbelief to get immersed in that footage, because you automatically assume that security footage is something that's real. And that might sound kind of silly, but I really, really strongly think it's true, just because it's basically a point of view movie. You can't say that about most movies. It is a point of view movie. The point of view you have just happens to be focused on this camera or this group of cameras. The movie all takes place from within its own universe. There's, with you included. It includes you within its own universe. Most movies do not do that at all. They, of course, make a lot of considerations for the audience, and that's one of the cons of found footage horror, that a lot of these traditionally good shot compositions and just visual storytelling devices that are generally valued are slightly more awkward to implement effectively without seeming contrived. It can be a bit of a problem. But if you're skillful enough, you can somewhat counteract that, I would say. You can reasonably effectively counteract that just by being clever with the way that you set up your shots, like they did in Creep. And of course, in Creep, they had a bit of an advantage because one of their main characters was incredibly eccentric, so prone to doing eccentric things. Makes it a lot easier to shoot a movie that's shot from his perspective. Well, it wasn't shot from his perspective. All right, I'm getting way too off the rails talking about Creep. That movie's so good. Everyone should watch it. It's on Netflix. It's amazing. It's probably my favorite found footage horror movie. But the thing about found footage cons, as I was saying, it's just traditionally less effective than normal cinematography in most respects, but it has an advantage in that immersion and in how atmospheric it is. It seems that a lot of horror movies tend to lean into atmosphere more than other genres, And another advantage, of course, of the found footage horror is that it's generally cheaper. So any budgetary restrictions that would stop oftentimes more experimental works from being published may not stop works from being published if they fall into this subgenre. So maybe you get a lot of like cool, more out there movies with like some crazy stuff happening, and maybe that's part of the appeal. And it's just something that we don't consider all the time. But when it comes to the worst not ARGs, when it comes to the worst found footage, Bo Burnham, 8th grade or grade 8, was not a horror movie. It was a found footage movie, which frankly used the found footage aspect very well. It used the found footage. It wasn't found footage. It was footage from this girl's cell phone who was vlogging her life, essentially. I couldn't stand that movie because I was in 8th grade at the time, or around that age group, and it was just so far detached from how 8th graders actually were in terms of just like the pop culture references and stuff. But that only stopped me because I was in 8th grade. I don't really think they were overly concerned about getting all the pop culture references insanely correct, especially because that was a movie about a girl learning to accept herself and, you know, that she's awkward, that she's kind of cringe, you know. It's about self-acceptance and being cringe and all that, if I remember correctly. I watched it a very long time ago. So it allows you to get, like, when she does something cringe in the movie, it feels more cringe because you can see it on a phone. And when I see it on a phone, I imagine it being posted to something like social media or other people viewing it. It automatically puts it in my mind, the fact that if this is saved on a phone or this is saved on a camera, anybody else can view it. It's not just me viewing this experience. So that movie uniquely uses it to make things cringier, which, depending on the mood you're in, is a pro or a con. But I didn't end up enjoying my viewing experience of that movie very much, though that doesn't seem to translate to me having any major knocks on the writing or anything like that. I mean, I barely remember it. I was in like 8th grade when it came out. But I haven't seen too many truly bad found footage horror. I really didn't like the Mandela Catalog. You might not know what that is, but it's an ARG, which is something I said I was going to get into later at the beginning of the video, and I remembered it. Let's go. So I believe the evolved form, or what it is going to take to scare us next, if you will, of this more immersive found footage style horror is definitely these ARGs, because the found footage style horror envelops you within the universe that it takes place in. But ARGs do that on more levels. ARGs are multimedia things. They're multimedia, experiences, which oftentimes include videos, stuff that you have to like data mine or like get into your computer for, but other people just do that and then you watch the YouTube video after. Photos, websites, like fake websites that they made just for this special series type of thing, and just all these different types of multimedia that you can get into on your computer. All of it is online. You can visit it online. It is the framework, like the bones of this media experience are literally in the real world online, and other people can interact with them. So I think it's even more immersive when you start actually getting, even more meta with it. When you start directly addressing the viewer, like in Doki Doki Literature Club or something like that, where you have to actually physically, like, not physically, but you have to actually manually go into your files, and it like messes with your files. Stuff like Inscription does that as well. I actually haven't played Doki Doki. I've just watched Markiplier play it, so don't quote me on that. But Inscription, it goes into your actual files and like changes stuff, which is definitely very bold. I'm sure a lot of people got very uncomfortable by that. But yeah, that's the point. If the media can make you uncomfortable, then it's probably a good atmospheric piece. And the best way to make someone uncomfortable is to get uncomfortably close to them. So the more that it can stretch out of fiction and into reality, of course, the less traditionally great storytelling, mostly visual techniques it can utilize. just because of the fact that it's getting more into just basically realistic. It's just along the gradient of realism to, I don't know, Hollywoodism, romanticism, cinematism is definitely not a word, but I think you know what I mean. It's found footage horror is just pretty far along the gradient towards total realism, and in that respect, I think if you were looking for something to take it farther, it would be stuff like ARGs, which fully are integrated into the internet in a weird way, and stuff that you have to physically seek out on the internet. And the internet is a place where obviously we all spend a lot of our time. At least I do. But yeah, the good ARG is this house has people in it. The only downside, of course, they're incredibly inconsistent with how much time. You're not going to know at the beginning how much time commitment it's going to be up front, which is a problem for a lot of people. It's a problem for me, honestly. And of course, unless you're like some crazy hacker, you're probably just going to have to watch somebody else who has fully dove down the rabbit hole of these things, and that can sort of take something away from it, especially when they're narrating it or something like that, because it warrants narration. But overall, it's some really, really cool stuff. It really hits you in a unique way, and I think that is the sort of next step in found footage or just artificial footage horror. Because now, not only if artificial footage horror considers you within its own universe, now ARGs sort of, you consider it within your universe. It's not even your choice because it just exists physically. It's a website that you can visit. It's a collection of websites that you can visit that are linked to each other, and videos. It seems plausible that it could happen in real life, suspension of disbelief. It's very case by case, but generally it just seems to the brain as more plausible, even if the plot is the same. And that's pretty much the gist of it, I would say. I think that those sorts of movies are particularly prone to being hit or miss due to their atmospheric nature. It's a lot harder to gauge whether somebody's going to vibe with a more atmospheric piece or not, unless you know them specifically, I would say. Unless you know what they're looking for, you know what kind of mood they're in. So it is a bit divisive, but that's the good stuff, because the more divisive it is, the better the highs for the people who do like it. So you might have to sit through some really trashy, low-budget found footage horror movies, but you may get to sit through some really good low-budget found footage horror movies. It really, like any other genre, it just depends on the team behind it, of course. But I would just say, yeah, the main quality is that it's further integrated into the real world, and it's like a first-person thing where you are looking at something that exists within the universe. That's about it.